An unseen thief is stealing your future right now, and the worst part is you handed it the key. It operates in silence, draining confidence while you sleep, erasing dreams before breakfast, convincing you that mediocrity is wisdom. You wonder why doors close before you knock, why your voice fades when it matters most, why exhaustion arrives before effort even begins. This isn't circumstance, this isn't genetics. This is warfare conducted entirely within your skull, and you're losing battles to an enemy wearing your face. The cruelest trick? You've been taught to trust this assassin, to treat its whispers as gospel truth. But what if every limiting belief you carry is nothing more than inherited fiction, repeated until it calcified into law? The ancient Stoics understood something profound. Our greatest wounds aren't inflicted by the world, but by the stories we whisper to ourselves when nobody's listening. So here's the question that might change everything. How many victories have you surrendered, not because you lacked capability, but because you believed a voice that should have been questioned years ago? This isn't motivational theater. This is about demolishing the prison you built from borrowed fears and reclaiming sovereignty over your own consciousness. If something inside you just stirred, if recognition is dawning, then hit subscribe as a declaration that you're done living according to someone else's script. This channel exists for those ready to think with precision, act with intention, and refuse the comfortable lies. Welcome to clarity. Welcome to Stoic wisdom. It begins with something small, almost forgettable. One failure, one criticism, one moment when shame burned hotter than you expected. You're terrible at this. You never finish anything. Who do you think you are? Initially, it's just noise, a momentary sting, but your mind is a recording device, and it captured everything. The words replay softly at first, background static, then they amplify. Each new challenge triggers the playback, and gradually these fragments stop being memories and become your operating system. You discover yourself hesitating, not because the obstacle is insurmountable, but because some internal program has already executed a defeat sequence. This voice doesn't scream warnings. It speaks with calm authority, with your rhythm and cadence. And the most insidious element is its perfect impersonation. It sounds exactly like rational thought, like the mature voice of experience protecting you from humiliation. What started as a fleeting doubt hardens into conviction, and conviction unchallenged becomes the iron law governing your existence. It dictates which rooms you enter, which words you speak, which dreams you're permitted to harbor. You construct a ceiling from repetition alone, not from actual limitation. You stop voicing ambitions because this voice ridicules aspiration. You contract your world because this voice catalogs every stumble. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, you begin architecting your reality not around capability but around terror. Nobody consciously chooses self-sabotage. Nobody wakes intending to become their own worst enemy. But when you stop interrogating this internal narrator, you begin obeying its legislation. And what makes this pattern so devastating is its familiarity. These inner doubts don't arrive with warning labels reading cognitive distortion. They dress as realism, as prudence, as hard-won wisdom. You convince yourself you're being strategic, that you're not one of those delusional optimists who ignore reality. But beneath the rationalization, you feel it, that gnawing dissonance, that persistent sense that you're inhabiting a smaller life than you're built for. Not because you attempted and failed, but because you never granted yourself permission to attempt fully. It's not failure that haunts the human spirit, it's the slow erosion of self-belief, the accumulation of unchosen days, the weight of roads never traveled, and it all originates with a whisper you never thought to challenge. The Stoics built their philosophy on radical skepticism of initial impressions. They insisted we must ruthlessly test our perceptions against truth. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul absorbs the color of its thoughts, like fabric soaking in dye. What hue have your thoughts been staining you with? And have you ever paused to investigate whether those thoughts originated with you or were planted by someone else's pain? Because so many of these internal prosecutors, the ones declaring you insufficient or unworthy, weren't born from your nature. They were installed during childhood, embedded in classrooms, forged in rejection, hammered in through comparison. Now they echo in your own voice, making them nearly impossible to identify, nearly impossible to resist. The problem is, we're rarely educated in this. We're taught humility, taught not to appear arrogant. But humility isn't synonymous with self-destruction. There's nothing virtuous about diminishing yourself inside your own mind. There's nothing honorable about living beneath your potential because you're terrified of disappointment. And there's nothing remotely stoic about remaining enslaved to unexamined beliefs. The Stoics embrace truth regardless of its difficulty, because they recognize truth as the sole path to liberation. That includes truth about yourself, not merely who you've been, but who you could become if you silenced every voice insisting you remain small. There's a particular peace that emerges when you start recognizing these thoughts for what they actually are: remnants of old wounds, not roadmaps to your future. That whisper, the one appearing before you speak, before you risk, before you leap, it's not prophecy. It's just habitual thinking, and like any habit, it can be dismantled, but only if you notice it, only if you stop confusing familiarity with accuracy. So what's the response? You observe, you watch, you question, and every time that voice manifests to constrain you, you ask 3 questions. Is this demonstrably true? Is this genuinely helpful? Is this absolutely necessary? More often than not, you'll discover it's merely an echo, nothing more substantial. An echo of fear masquerading as intelligence, an echo of failure misinterpreted as prophecy, an echo of suffering disguised as caution. And you possess the power to let that echo dissipate, because each time you act despite that voice, it loses voltage. Each time you accomplish something you'd convinced yourself was impossible, you reclaim territory. Not just confidence, authorship. The capacity to define yourself not by historical events, but by present choices. You don't need perfection. You don't need fearlessness. You simply need to stop living under the tyranny of a whisper that was never qualified to lead you. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness observing them. You are not your history. You are the consciousness choosing what it signifies now. And you are not that voice declaring impossibility. You are the stillness remaining after it's silenced. That's the danger of repetition. A single moment of doubt evolves into habit. That habit crystallizes into belief. And a belief left unexamined transforms into identity. I failed mutates into I am failure. I struggle with this becomes I am incapable. Once fused to your identity, it alters how you navigate reality. You stop pursuing positions you care about. You withdraw from meaningful conversations. You reject opportunities not because you lack qualification, but because the version of yourself you've constructed doesn't believe it belongs there. You've erected walls but convinced yourself they're simply the natural boundaries of your world. This is how the mind deceives you into a constricted existence. You begin conforming your behavior to match your self-image rather than the reverse. You select relationships where you won't be seen too deeply. You aim lower, dream quieter, speak softer, not because reality demands it, but because the you you've come to believe in doesn't feel entitled to more. This is the gradual theft of freedom, not through external force, but through thought alone. You don't require physical chains to live imprisoned. You just need to believe the wrong thing about yourself long enough. And that's the tragedy. Most people never realize they're carrying a fraudulent identity. It's been assembled gradually from pain, rejection, misunderstanding, and silence. A teacher's careless remark, a failed attempt you personalized too deeply, a parent's judgment that went unchallenged, a mistake that lingered too long in your consciousness. Across time, these moments stitched together into a narrative, and you never edited the narrative. You just started living by it. You stopped asking, "Is this who I genuinely am?" and started assuming the answer was yes. That's not growth, that's surrender. And the Stoics never believed in surrender. A Stoic would argue that events don't shape us. Our interpretation of events does. Epictetus warned that if you desire freedom, you must first identify who's enslaving you. Often it's your own consciousness. That's why identity isn't sacred. It's not immune to examination. In fact, it must be examined, because if you don't know where your beliefs originated, you have no idea whose life you're actually living. Is it yours? Or is it the echo of someone else's fear that you internalized and mistook for self-knowledge? There's something powerful in realizing your identity isn't fixed. Your personality, your habits, even your fears are patterns, not chains. And patterns can shift. The mind will resist. It will insist, "This is just how I am." But that's inertia speaking, not truth. You are not obligated to remain yesterday's version of yourself simply because it's familiar. You are permitted to evolve. You are permitted to outgrow the story you were handed. And yes, that means releasing certain environments, certain relationships, even certain versions of yourself. When you begin unlearning who you are not, you create space to become who you are. That's the genuine work, not becoming something new, but shedding what was never authentically yours. And that process initiates when you look at a belief and ask, "Does this expand me or contract me?" That's your compass. That's your North Star. The beliefs that stretch you, challenge you, call you forward, those are worth keeping. The ones that keep you frozen, that protect your wounds more than your potential, those must be released. You're not here to repeat history. You're here to transcend it. And if your thoughts have become a prison, it's time to question the walls. Not all of them were constructed with reason. Some were built with pain, and you don't have to keep inhabiting them. The mind is perpetually seeking coherence. It craves consistency, even if that consistency keeps you trapped. So when you carry a belief like, "I'm not good enough," your brain doesn't attempt to disprove it. It seeks confirmation. It filters out evidence contradicting the belief and clings to anything supporting it. You forget moments where you demonstrated strength, where you were capable, where you succeeded. Instead, your mind circles back to every flaw, every misstep, every uncomfortable silence or failed attempt. Not because those moments define you, but because they align with the story you've been telling yourself. The tragedy is once the story establishes roots, your actions begin conforming to it. You avoid challenges that might reveal something greater within you. You remain silent when you should speak. You let others lead, even when you know the direction. You retreat from opportunities, relationships, growth. Not because you don't desire them, but because some part of you has already predetermined failure. It's not that you lack ambition. You lack self-authorization. And in that subtle withdrawal, the story validates itself again. You didn't try, so you didn't succeed, and the belief survives, nourished by your own hesitation. This isn't random. It's not bad luck or personality. It's a cycle. You believe something negative about yourself. That belief shapes your actions. Your actions produce results, or their absence, that reinforce the original belief. Then the cycle revolves again, a loop so smooth and habitual, it starts feeling like truth. But it's not truth. It's programming. Not written by destiny, but by repetition. And the worst part is you might not even recognize it's happening. You just feel exhausted, frustrated, stuck. As if, no matter what you do, Something invisible holds you back, and that invisible force is you, your unchallenged narrative. The Stoics grasped this trap intimately. They taught that pain itself isn't the problem, it's the meaning we assign to it. A mistake doesn't damage us because of the error. It damages us because of what we conclude that error reveals about who we are. Failure doesn't destroy us. Our shame surrounding failure does. We collapse not because of the world, but because of how we interpret the world. Seneca once wrote that we are more frequently frightened than harmed, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And in this cycle of self-sabotage, the suffering is largely imagined, but the consequences are devastatingly real. What makes the loop so potent is it doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It appears in daily decisions. You receive a good opportunity, but your mind reminds you of the last time you failed. You hesitate. You decline. You tell yourself, perhaps, next time. But next time never arrives. Not because the world doesn't offer it, but because you don't permit yourself to seize it. Even when you succeed, the cycle finds ways to distort the narrative. You attribute it to luck. You minimize the achievement. You redirect credit away from yourself. Why? Because deep down, the belief hasn't transformed. And until the belief shifts, nothing else truly can. There's no villain here except misunderstanding. You're not weak, you're conditioned. You're not broken, you're repeating. And the first step out of the loop isn't drastic action, it's awareness. Watching the pattern unfold in real time and asking, is this genuinely who I am, or just who I've believed myself to be? That question alone can destabilize the cycle's foundation, because what the cycle fears most is consciousness. The moment you perceive it, it loses authority. Not instantly, but enough for you to make a different choice. Identity plays a role too. The belief feeds the behavior, but the behavior also reinforces who you think you are. If you see yourself as someone who perpetually surrenders, then surrendering feels normal, even comfortable. If you believe you always overthink, then overthinking becomes your default, even if it damages you. These identities aren't permanent. They're practiced. Every time you act from them, you strengthen them, but every time you act against them, you loosen their grip. Rebuilding doesn't mean pretending. It doesn't mean shouting affirmations over doubts. It means selecting a different response when the cycle activates. It means taking a breath instead of reacting, saying yes even when you're terrified, staying 1 second longer in the uncomfortable space where growth happens. The belief won't vanish immediately, but it will weaken with every choice that contradicts it. You break the cycle not through force, but through awareness and gentle defiance. In the end, the real cost of self-sabotage isn't just missed opportunities, it's the quiet erosion of self-respect. It's the gnawing sense that you're betraying something inside you, something deeper, stronger, more honest. And that pain, over time, becomes unbearable. Not because you're failing, but because you know you're playing small in a life that keeps calling you to rise. And even if you ignore it, the call doesn't disappear. It just grows quieter until one day you forget what it ever felt like to trust yourself fully. But the truth is still there, waiting, beneath the noise, beneath the repetition, beneath the story. And the moment you're ready to stop proving the old belief right is the moment you begin proving something else instead. Not with perfection, not with certainty, but with one new decision at a time. What you whisper to yourself in private doesn't stay trapped in thought. It moves. It spreads like a signal transmitted across your entire system. A single sentence like, "I can't do this," doesn't remain in the mind as a harmless concept. It travels into the body. It sinks into the breath, the shoulders, the stomach, the spine. Suddenly, your breathing becomes shallow. Your muscles contract. Your posture collapses inward. Your heart accelerates, not because of external threats, but because of the narrative you've been rehearsing in the privacy of your skull. The body, unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones, prepares for survival, and in doing so, it quietly deactivates the parts of you that could have performed, created, or connected. You don't lose because you lack capability. You lose because your mind has trained your body to expect the loss as inevitable. We rarely see how much damage occurs before we even act. Before the speech, before the decision, before the risk. The damage begins with perception, with conditioned fear masquerading as truth. And because it feels so familiar, because you've heard it countless times, you don't resist it, you obey it. The voice inside says, "This is too much," and the body prepares for collapse. And that moment, the one where your knees lock, your voice falters, your focus slips, it's not weakness. It's the physical result of a story you've rehearsed far too well. A story not grounded in reality, but in repetition. The lie doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It just needs to be constant. This is the hidden weight so many people carry. They think they're broken because they freeze under pressure, because their body betrays them when it matters most. But the betrayal didn't start in the body, it started in thought. Years of doubt, internal criticism, and unspoken fear leave a mark, and the body remembers. Not in words, but in tension, in resistance, in hesitation. That's why progress often feels blocked, not by external forces, but by internal reactions. You try to move forward, but something invisible pulls you back. Not because you aren't ready, but because your nervous system still believes it's in danger. The Stoics understood this intimately. They didn't seek control over the world. They sought control over their response to it. Because they knew that when the mind is calm, the body follows. And when the mind is in chaos, the body cannot perform. Seneca once said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," and that suffering infiltrates our biology. When you anticipate failure, when you imagine embarrassment, when you brace for disappointment, your body shifts into defense mode. And in defense mode, creativity shuts down. Memory falters, confidence disappears. You're not accessing your potential because your body believes it's under threat. And it only knows what your mind tells it, and the mind has been talking for a long time. It's been writing a script. Every moment of self-doubt, every time you said, "I'm not ready," or "I'm not like them," or "this never goes right for me," it took notes. And now, before you even step into a challenge, the script plays automatically. Your body listens, your actions follow, and you live out the same pattern again and again, not realizing the pattern began in silence. Your body is not your enemy, it's your mirror. It reflects back what you believe deeply, often unconsciously, about yourself. And if those beliefs are soaked in doubt, then your body will respond accordingly. But if the mind can harm the body, it can also heal it. If the mind can weaken, it can also strengthen. The Stoics trained their perception because they knew that fear distorts not just the mind, but the way we move through life. A calm mind doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means clarity despite fear, presence despite uncertainty, and that presence is what opens the door to your real capacity. Because here's the truth, you're not failing because you're incapable. You're failing because you've taught your body how to fail, not on purpose, not maliciously, but through repetition, through internal dialogue, through emotional memories that were never healed. And every time you reinforce the idea that this is just how I am, you lock that training in deeper. You become the coach and the critic, the author and the prisoner all at once. But training can be undone, not in a single moment, but choice by choice. The next time you feel your body react with fear, pause. Ask yourself, what thought preceded this? What belief is fueling this tension? It might not be loud. It might not even sound like fear. It might sound like logic. But if it's preparing you to fail before you've even tried, it's a lie. And lies, once seen clearly, begin to lose their grip. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That strength is already in you, beneath the tension, beneath the habits, beneath the noise. And the more you speak to your body with truth, the more it will begin to believe you again. Not the fear, not the conditioning, but you, the one behind it all. The one who's finally ready to show up, not in survival mode, but in self-command. That's where your real potential lies. Not just in thought, but in motion. In how you breathe, in how you walk, in how you speak, and in how you choose to respond when the old script starts playing and you quietly, firmly decide to write a new one. There's a kind of grief that never makes it into words. It doesn't come with ceremonies or condolences. It lingers quietly, pressed into the background of your life. It's the grief of potential, of what you could have done, who you could have become, but didn't. Not because it wasn't possible, but because something in you decided it wasn't worth the risk. That decision rarely feels dramatic. It's subtle. You pass on the opportunity. You tell yourself the timing isn't right. You convince yourself that someone else is better suited. And just like that, you bury another piece of yourself under a layer of false safety. You don't always know what you've lost until years pass and the weight of it catches up. It doesn't shout, it simply haunts you. In quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, you feel it. That discomfort, that edge of regret. You remember the ideas you never chased, the conversations you avoided, the talents you hid. Not because you didn't care, but because you were afraid they would reveal something about you that you weren't ready to face. So you stayed silent. You stayed still. You rationalized your way out of growth, all in the name of being realistic. The problem is that fear rarely calls itself fear. It wears the mask of logic. It says, be careful. It says, that's not practical. It says, what if it doesn't work? And you listen because those thoughts sound responsible. They sound wise. But underneath, they are rooted in a belief that you are not enough. That belief becomes your compass. And every decision guided by it pulls you 1 degree off course. Not far at first, just slightly. But years later, you look up and realize you're nowhere near the life you once imagined. There's a sorrow that comes with that realization. Not loud, not chaotic, just a quiet ache. The Stoics didn't fear death, they feared wasted life. Death is inevitable, but to live without becoming what you are capable of, that's a tragedy entirely of our own making. And unlike death, it happens slowly, choice by choice. You don't just wake up with unused potential. You carry it daily. You feel it in the restless moments, in the fatigue that has nothing to do with your body. It's the soul dragging under the weight of what it knows you're meant for. We talk a lot about achievement, about goals and success and discipline, but we rarely talk about this, about the psychological and emotional toll of self-abandonment, of seeing the best in yourself and turning away from it. There's nothing more painful than being conscious of your own strength and still choosing not to use it. Not because you're lazy, but because you've been conditioned to doubt it. Because every time you tried to reach higher, something told you it wasn't yours to reach for, so you lowered your hand. And each time you did, your spirit dimmed a little more. Carl Jung once said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because once you see yourself clearly, once you acknowledge the depths of your strength, your creativity, your desire, you can no longer make peace with staying small. You can no longer blame others for the parts of your life that feel incomplete. You realize that you were never waiting for the right time, the right person, or the right path. You were waiting for permission from yourself, and that permission never comes unless you take it. Most people think the pain they feel is about what they lost, but often it's about what they never gave themselves the chance to discover. You didn't lose the job you never applied for. You didn't lose the love you never opened your heart to. You didn't lose the dream you never pursued. With full commitment. That's where the true grief lives. Not in failure, but in absence. In the parts of your life that remained unlived because fear whispered just loud enough to be believed. The tragedy of potential left unused is that it never really disappears. It stays with you. It presses against the walls of your mind. It follows you into jobs, into relationships, into moments of stillness. It waits, hoping you'll notice. And when you don't, it turns into frustration, into bitterness, into resentment, not of others, but of yourself. Of the version of you that could have been more honest, more courageous, more alive. And deep down, you know it. But if that pain is there, it also means something else is still there too. The spark, the part of you that remembers what it once wanted, what it still wants. That part hasn't died, it's just been buried. And if you listen closely, you can feel it move. When you stop pretending that playing small is noble. There is no virtue in self-denial, not when it comes at the cost of your soul. The Stoics believed in living according to nature. And part of your nature is growth, evolution, rising toward your highest form, not for status, but for peace. Because there's no peace in avoidance, only tension that grows quieter and heavier with time. Aristotle believed that where your talents and the needs of the world cross, there lies your vocation. Your potential isn't a luxury, it's a responsibility, not just to you, but to the people you could inspire, help, or love more fully. When you suppress it, you don't just betray yourself. You rob the world of something only you can offer. And whether that offering is small or great doesn't matter. What matters is that it's real, that it's true, that it's lived. No one escapes the pain of potential left unused, but some choose to transform it, to turn it into fuel, to look at what they've lost and say, no more, to stop mourning and start moving. That shift doesn't require a miracle. It doesn't require perfection. It only requires that you stop treating your dreams like fragile things. They are not. They are resilient, and so are you. The moment you let go of the belief that it's too late is the moment you begin again. So if there's something inside you stirring as you hear this, listen. Not to the voice that tells you it's foolish or risky or selfish, but to the quiet one underneath. The one that knows what you were meant to become. The one that's been waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop waiting too. It's one of the most convincing liars you'll ever meet. The voice in your own head. It sounds like you. It uses your vocabulary, your tone, your memories. It speaks with authority, like it knows something you don't. It doesn't scream. It doesn't even argue. It simply states, "You're not ready. That's not for you. You'll mess it up again." And you believe it, not because it makes sense, but because it's been there for so long that you've stopped questioning it. It became familiar. And familiarity can be mistaken for truth when no one teaches you how to separate the two. That voice isn't your enemy in disguise. It's your past pretending to be your protector. It was built piece by piece from experiences that hurt, from rejection you never processed, from mistakes you blamed yourself too harshly for. It grew from comments you took to heart at an age when you didn't know how to filter what deserved to stay. It learned your fears, studied your wounds, memorized your weakest moments, and now it shows up at the worst times, pretending to be your guide. But it's not guiding you forward. It's keeping you small, keeping you safe, keeping you stuck. The real tragedy is that no one told you that you could challenge it. No one said you had the right to talk back to that voice, that you could look it in the eye and say, based on what? Or ask, is this truth or just fear wearing a mask? That inner critic doesn't thrive because it's powerful. It thrives because it goes unchallenged. You let it narrate your life. You let it define what's possible. And the story it tells is always the same. You're not enough. Not now, not yet, maybe not ever. But the Stoics would tell you otherwise. They questioned everything, every impression, every judgment, every thought that passed through the mind. They understood that the mind, if left unchecked, would build false realities. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. So if your thoughts are soaked in criticism and fear, what color do you think your life will become? It's not your circumstances that limit you, it's the voice interpreting them. The inner critic isn't objective. It doesn't see your potential. It only sees the risk, the pain, the shame. And if you let it, it will make you believe that's all there is. This voice doesn't age with you. It doesn't evolve. It just repeats. It's the same voice that doubted you at 15, now dressing itself up as logic in your 30s. It's outdated programming still running the show, and the longer you obey it, the deeper it writes itself into your identity. It convinces you that fear is wisdom, that hesitation is maturity, that settling is peace, but fear isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's just a shadow left over from a time you didn't yet know your strength. And hesitation isn't always caution. It's often the residue of a moment where you learn to doubt yourself too deeply and too soon. The way out isn't loud. It doesn't require shouting affirmations or pretending you don't hear the voice at all. It begins quietly, with awareness, with catching the voice in the act and naming it. That sentence you just heard, was it true or just familiar? Did it come from a place of strength, or did it echo something that once broke you? And once you ask those questions, something shifts. The voice may still be there, but it starts to lose its grip. You stop mistaking it for authority. You stop handing it the pen, because as long as it holds the pen, the story of your life will stay the same. It'll follow the same arc: missed chances, quiet frustration, unexplored potential. And none of that will be because you weren't capable. It will be because the narrator in your mind convinced you not to try. But you can take that pen back. You don't have to wait until the voice disappears. It probably never will, but you can write in its presence. You can move forward with it whispering, because the goal was never to silence fear. The goal was to stop letting fear speak on your behalf. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And that's what the inner critic does. It directs from the shadows. It inserts its judgment so smoothly into your thinking that you begin to believe your limits are just reality. But they're not. They're boundaries placed by a part of you that was trying to keep you safe, but no longer knows how to let you grow. You're allowed to outgrow the voices that shaped you. You're allowed to update your mind. You don't owe loyalty to the part of yourself that only learned how to shrink. You owe it to the part that's been waiting to expand. That part that feels energized when you imagine something more. The one that sees risk not as threat, but as possibility. It's quieter, softer, and often drowned out. But it's there. And every time you question the critic, that part grows louder. Every time you move forward despite the fear, it gets stronger. That's how you shift the balance, not by forcing the critic to leave, but by refusing to let it be in charge anymore. There's no shame in having that voice. Everyone has it. But the difference between those who live small and those who rise isn't whether the voice exists. It's who they choose to listen to, and that's a choice you make in small, almost invisible moments. When you hit send on something you were scared to share. When you speak up when your voice shakes. When you try even though part of you still doubts. Those moments may not feel heroic, but they are. Because they're you taking the story back. And you don't need to do it all at once. Just one sentence at a time. One choice that says, I see the fear, but I'm not letting it drive. One moment where you trust the deeper voice inside. The one that knows what you're capable of, even if you haven't fully seen it yet. That's the voice you build your life around. The one that doesn't demand perfection, only courage. only honesty, only the willingness to stop letting your past speak louder than your present. This is your mind, your story, your authority. And no critic, no matter how familiar, deserves to keep writing it for you. It doesn't begin with a war. It doesn't require force, shouting, or silencing the voice inside your head. The first step to reclaiming your narrative is simply this: watching, just noticing, paying attention to when the voice appears, what it says, and what pulls it forward. Maybe it's when you're about to try something new. Maybe it shows up right after you failed. Maybe it whispers most loudly when you're close to something that actually matters to you. The pattern reveals everything, not just what you fear, but how your fear disguises itself as reason. That's what you begin with, not reaction, but observation, not a fight, but awareness. Because most people are too quick to believe the voice or too desperate to silence it. But when you simply observe it without immediately reacting, something incredible happens. It loses power. You realize that just because it's loud doesn't mean it's true, and just because it feels familiar doesn't mean it's wise. Some of those phrases have been with you for years. You've rehearsed them, repeated them, lived by them, but that doesn't mean they're right. That doesn't mean they belong in the story you're writing now. So you start small. You catch a phrase like, "I'm not good at this," and you change it. Not with delusion, but with honesty. "I'm still learning." You replace, "I always screw this up," with, "I'm figuring it out." You stop labeling yourself like a finished product and start describing yourself like a work in progress, because that's what you are, and there's power in admitting it. Not as an excuse, but as a way to reclaim authorship. These shifts may seem insignificant, like changing a single line in a long book, but that's how stories are rewritten, one sentence at a time. Language shapes identity. The words you use about yourself either trap you in limitation or open space for growth. When you say, "I'm a mess," your brain stops looking for solutions. But when you say, "I'm overwhelmed right now and I'm working through it," you create room, you create momentum, and more than anything, you create agency. That's the quiet revolution of changing your internal dialogue. It puts the pen back in your hand. It turns you from the passive audience of your own life into the active author. The Stoics believed that while you cannot control external events, you can control how you interpret them and how you respond. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That includes how you react to yourself. When you catch the voice saying you're failing, you don't have to argue or collapse. You can say, "Maybe I'm struggling today, but that doesn't mean the story ends here." That one shift keeps you moving. It keeps the door open. And the truth is, most of what you need isn't certainty. It's space. Space to grow, to try again, to evolve without shame. Carl Jung believed that the process of individuation, the path to becoming who you truly are, requires confronting the parts of yourself you've hidden, feared, or misunderstood. And that includes your inner voice. Not to destroy it, but to question it. To learn where it came from, who it sounds like, what it protects you from. Because sometimes the voice that keeps you small was formed during moments when smallness felt safe. It was a survival mechanism, a way to cope. But survival isn't the goal anymore. Now it's about wholeness, and that means reclaiming the parts of yourself that you abandoned when you were trying to stay safe. The journey back to self-authorship doesn't happen all at once. It happens in those ordinary, invisible moments. When you pause before making a decision and ask, "Am I doing this because it's true to me or because I'm afraid?" When you fail and hear that old voice begin to speak, but you respond with a new one. When you take a step forward even though your self-doubt is begging you to retreat. These moments don't look heroic, but they are. Because they mark the beginning of a different kind of life, a life that's not ruled by the past. Time isn't just lost in distraction. It's lost when you live a life that isn't yours because you let someone else's voice narrate it. But the good news is it's not too late to change the script. Not through force, but through steady, deliberate attention. You don't need to flip your life upside down. You just need to start speaking to yourself with a little more truth, a little more kindness, and a lot more ownership. This is about remembering that the story isn't finished. You haven't missed your chance. You haven't lost the pen forever. You've just forgotten that it was always in your hand. You were waiting for some signal that it was okay to begin again. This is it. This moment right now is your signal, not to erase everything that's happened, but to write forward from it. To take the lessons and the pain and the missteps and use them as ink, not chains. You are not the mistakes you've made. You are not the voice that narrates your fears. You are the one who can observe it all, and from that observation, choose something better, something more aligned, something more free. This doesn't mean you'll never doubt again. It means you'll stop letting doubt be the author. It means you'll notice when it shows up and decide with intention whether it belongs on the page. That's what reclaiming your narrative really is. Not a dramatic rewrite, but a quiet, consistent refusal to let fear hold the pen. It's choosing to tell the truth. Not the harsh, punishing version of truth, but the deeper one. The one that says you're still learning, that you're still capable, that you're allowed to grow, stumble, and still move forward. And that even if your voice shakes when you speak up, it's still your voice. It still matters. And it's time to use it. There's a version of you buried beneath the noise. Not some fantasy or unreachable ideal, but a real, capable, deeply grounded version of you that exists just beneath the surface. Just below the weight of every "I'm not ready," every "I can't," every "what if I fail." It's not that this version doesn't exist, it's that it's been quieted, drowned out by years of learned hesitation, smothered by a pattern of thoughts that were never questioned, only obeyed. What you call me is often just the accumulation of repetition. What others told you, what fear whispered to you, and what you told yourself in moments of pain. But there's something deeper than all of that, something untouched, something waiting. When you start turning inward, not to analyze or fix, but simply to see clearly, you begin to notice the gap between the voice and the truth. You begin to hear your inner critic not as wisdom, but as static, as background noise that has been playing so long you forgot you could turn it down. And in that space, something awakens. Not all at once, not like a fire, but like a steady pulse. You stop obeying the thought that tells you you're not enough. You stop retreating at the first sign of discomfort. You pause, you breathe, you observe. And from that stillness, a different kind of strength starts to emerge. This strength doesn't come from proving yourself. It doesn't roar. It doesn't need to. It's quiet and deliberate. It's the kind of strength that moves differently, not to impress, but to express. Not to perform, but to show up fully. And as you begin to act from this place, you notice that the world doesn't shift first. You do. The fear is still there, but it's not steering. The voice of doubt still speaks, but it no longer defines the outcome. You begin to realize that the power you thought you lacked wasn't missing. It was buried beneath obedience to a story that was never really yours. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." And awakening doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means reclaiming what you've ignored, the creativity that went unused, the confidence that was dismissed, the courage that showed up in glimpses but was quickly covered over by the mind's demand for certainty. This isn't about reinventing yourself. It's about returning to what was always there, what was simply waiting for you to listen more deeply than you ever have before. There is nothing wrong with fear. There is nothing weak about doubt, but there is something tragic about mistaking them for truth. When you do that, you give them power they were never meant to hold. You live in their shadow. You shrink your voice. You turn away from the very life that would have helped you grow. But once you stop assuming the inner voice is the final authority, once you test it, question it, sit with it instead of running from it, you begin to sense a shift. You recognize that much of what you avoided wasn't because you weren't capable, but because you had never seen what was beneath the fear, and what was beneath it, you. The Stoics believed we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Most of the pain that holds us back doesn't come from the world. It comes from within. It's imagined failure, imagined judgment, imagined collapse. But the body still reacts. The mind still obeys. And so you live as though the threat is real, even when it's not. But just as the imagination can create suffering, it can also unlock freedom. When you begin to imagine what might happen if you trusted yourself, if you acted in alignment with your deeper self, not your conditioned one, that's when possibility becomes real again. You begin to walk differently, not because the path has changed, but because you have. You're no longer looking for proof that you're allowed to begin. You begin, and that becomes the proof. You take the step, and then the voice shows up. But this time, you don't retreat. You keep walking, because you've learned something essential. Courage doesn't mean silence in your head. It means action even when the noise is still there, even when the old story tries to remind you of who you were. Seneca said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." And most of that waste happens in the in-between, in the time between the impulse to act and the decision to doubt it. That small space where you hear the idea, feel the pull, sense the truth, and then overthink it until it dies. But you can reclaim that space. You can shorten the distance between your knowing and your action. That's what it means to live from your deeper self. You don't wait for the noise to disappear. You move anyway. And with each step you take in defiance of the old voice, that voice gets quieter, not because it vanishes, but because it loses authority. It becomes what it always was, just a thought, not a law, not a prophecy, just a thought. And you are no longer bound by it. You get to respond with something new, something that says, "I hear you, but I'm choosing this anyway." And in that choice, your power returns, not as something given, but as something remembered. So if you feel like the life you want is out of reach, ask yourself this: is it really far away, or is it just buried under all the noise you've mistaken for truth? Because maybe the dream hasn't changed. Maybe you haven't even changed. Maybe you've just been distracted. And maybe now is the time to listen more closely. Not to the critic, but to the part of you that's been waiting, patiently, silently, powerfully. You don't need a new life. You just need to return to the one that was yours before fear took the pen. And if you do that, if you show up not as a perfect version of yourself, but as a present one, you'll see that the power you thought you were missing was always within reach. Not in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to let it lead. Not in becoming someone else, but in finally stepping into who you've always been. You were never the voice that doubted you. You were the quiet strength beneath it, waiting to be remembered. Your story isn't over. And the next chapter begins the moment you choose to write it yourself. If this spoke to something inside you, there's more waiting. Before you go, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps others find this message when they need it most. And if you're ready to keep walking this path of clarity, strength, and self-mastery, subscribe to Stoic Wisdom. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing growth over comfort. And thank you for being a part of this journey.